I actually first got interested in science when I was a very young child. My mum tells me that from the age of 7, I wanted to be a physicist. I looked up at the stars and thought, I want to understand this universe that I find myself in. A lot of people are really fascinated by space and particle physics and all these sort of frontiers of physical science, where we got things that we simply don't understand about the very nature of the universe. But what I understood as I went through my studies is actually there are some senses in which we know more about the distant stars than we do about what's going on inside our bodies every minute of every day. There are trillions of cells inside your body, all talking to each other, communicating, acting individually. The complexity of those systems means there are some really big questions in biology. And so I actually changed career because of a graph. It's a very simple graph. It's a graph of how likely you are to die, depending on how old you are. And as a human being, your risk of death roughly doubles every 8 years. So what that means is, well, I'm 39 years old at the moment. My risk of death this year is about 1 in 1,000. And I quite like those odds. But of course, the bad news is that if we carry on doubling and doubling and doubling that very small number, it can eventually get very big very quickly. So if I'm lucky enough to live into my 90s, I'll have a risk of death about 1 in 6 per year. That's life and death at the roll of a dice. If we can understand this fundamental ticking clock inside all of our biology, maybe we can come up with some medicines, some treatments that can slow down that advancing risk of death, that can slow down that advancing risk of disease, and have a much greater impact than treating any one of those diseases individually. And what's really changed, I think, in the last sort of 10, 20 years is we finally have a biological understanding of what the aging process is. We've got this list now of hallmarks of aging. These are the fundamental cellular, molecular building blocks of our bodies that go wrong as we get older. The 5th hallmark is what's called the accumulation of senescent cells. These are essentially old cells that build up in our bodies as we get older. These might be cells that are divided too many times. They might be cells that have acquired so much DNA damage that the body wants to slam on the brakes. The definition of these cells is that they stop dividing. We have a lot of places in the body where cells need to divide in order to replenish our tissues, so places like our skin, our intestines. These are, stressful environments for a cell. And the way that our body has chosen to deal with that isn't to make our cells perfectly robust, it's to make them essentially disposable. And we constantly turn over the surface of our skin, refreshing that skin surface every few days, in fact. But the problem is that if those cells divide too many times, they become senescent, they then stop dividing, your skin stops being refreshed, and that's one of the causes of skin aging. But the bigger problem with senescent cells is that they emit this toxic cocktail of molecules that seems to accelerate perhaps the whole of the aging process around the body. And that means that as you accumulate them with time, then that can increase your risk of cancer, increase your risk of heart disease, increase your risk of dementia, frailty, all kinds of different things that we've connected to the process of this accumulation of senescent cells. And so the hope is that by understanding these 10 hallmarks on that list, we can then develop treatments that can remove these senescent cells, that can sort out that DNA damage, that can improve the aging of our immune system. And if we can do that, then we can perhaps impact most, even all of the aging process with just a handful of medications. We can effectively make mice in the lab biologically younger. There was some research that came out of the Mayo Clinic in 2018 where they waited until the mice were 24 months old. And that's pretty old for a mouse. That's sort of 60 or 70 years old in human terms. And they gave them a cocktail of drugs that acted as what's called a senolytic treatment. So this means it kills those senescent cells, but leaves the rest of the cells of the body intact. So firstly, the mice that had had the drugs lived a bit longer, which is a good start, but they weren't just dragging out that period of frailty at the end of life, they were healthier too. So they got less cancer, they got less heart disease, they got fewer cataracts. The mice that had had the drugs were fitter, so they basically send the mice to the gym in these experiments. They got a tiny little mouse-sized treadmill. And they found that the mice that had the drugs, they could run further and faster on that treadmill than their litter mates who are the same age and hadn't had the drugs. It improves their cognitive function. So if you get an old mouse and stick it in a maze, it's often a bit anxious, doesn't really want to explore. Whereas if you give the mice these senolytic drugs, it seems to rejuvenate some of that youthful curiosity. And finally, these animals, they just look great, because you do not need to be an expert mouse biologist to see which ones have had the drugs and which ones haven't. They've got better fur, they've got thicker, plumper skin, brighter eyes. They just look like younger animals. And so what this really shows us is that by tackling these hallmarks, tackling these fundamental underlying causes of the aging process, we can hit this whole range of different age-related problems and turn back the clock. And actually, these senolytics are already undergoing some human trials. There are 20 or 30 companies that are trying to turn this from an idea that works in the lab to something that actually might be usable in the clinic for human beings. The first treatments will probably be pills, because we are very, very used to developing pharmaceutical medicines. Were you to take one of these senolytic drugs, it might be that you can take it for a week, clear out all of those senescent cells, and then you don't have any of those cells anymore, so you can just wait for them to accumulate, perhaps for a year, perhaps for 5 years, we just don't know, and then take another dose at that point to clear out those cells and keep you as biologically young, as healthy as possible. Might be a bit like a visit to a dentist once every 6 or 12 months for your sort of aging checkup. And they'll do a bunch of measurements, they'll measure the length of your telomeres, they'll take your epigenetic age, and they'll work out what cocktail of treatments can optimize your health. So I think we don't know exactly what this is going to look like. I think there are going to be a range of different ways that we can intervene. And I think actually nothing's off the table. Most drugs are very, very cheap to produce. The reason they're so expensive is because of the patent system. And as soon as drugs come off patent, then generics often cost pennies per pill. Imagine we had a pill that could slow down aging. It could dramatically reduce healthcare costs, for example. And so governments might be very, very keen to distribute these pills as widely as possible, because it'll actually end up saving the government money. We should be aware of this idea that equality of access is important, but I think the most likely outcome isn't necessarily that, billionaires are going to live forever and the rest of us are going to struggle on in, literal mortal toil. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first known written stories, was about someone pursuing this quest for immortality. It's tempting to look back and look at all these crazy quack cures from centuries past and say, people have been promising immortality for thousands of years. And that actually really influences the discourse about this science today. And so when I talk on stage about aging biology, the questions I get asked are often about, do we want to live forever? Is this just going to be available for billionaires? It's almost as though people place aging in this very separate moral, ethical category to all other kinds of medical research. A futuristic technology, maybe this is going to be hundreds and hundreds of years into the future. And I think what we often forget is that actually the amount of time that humans live for has changed dramatically, even just in the last couple of hundred years. So if you rewind the clock back to, say, the 1830s, 1840s, life expectancies in most of what we would call the rich countries today were probably 30 or 40 years old. And in those 200 years, we've increased life expectancy in the best performing country in the world by 3 months every single year. It's actually remarkable how straight this line is. It's almost suspicious, because it's been caused by this constellation of different causes as we go through history. We've effectively doubled what it means to be human. We've already undergone this enormous first longevity revolution. And I think what we need now is to start the second. Ultimately, what I care about isn't living thousands and thousands of years. It's reducing suffering in the here and now. It's not so much about lifespan, how long you live, but health span, how long you can stay healthy. Aging is the biggest cause of death globally. More than 2/3 of deaths around the world are caused by the aging process. And it's not just the deaths, it's the suffering that precedes those deaths. All of these diseases, they have terrible symptoms. They can last for years, maybe for decades. Then there are the things we don't even call diseases. The frailty, the cognitive decline, the stuff that means that you can't engage in your hobbies, you can't play with your grandkids anymore because you're just too weak to do so. And this is why I think that aging is our greatest humanitarian challenge, which might sound like a slightly strange thing to say of this natural process that a lot of us have come to completely accept. But I think that viewed biologically, that's the inevitable conclusion. If you look around the animal kingdom, there are animals that literally do not age. I find the Galapagos tortoise just really inspirational. They have a risk of death that is flat with time. When they're adults, their risk of death doesn't change depending on how long ago they were born. They don't get any more frail, they stay active until very late in life. They can even reproduce until very, very late in their years. So a Galapagos tortoise perhaps is not the greatest ambassador for longevity. They're slow and wrinkly throughout their lives, but they're probably as sprightly aged 150 as they are aged 50. And so I think we can all aspire to just being a bit more tortoise. It's possible to age more gracefully. Trying to create treatments that can keep people healthier for a longer period. maybe we can become a little bit more ageless like they are.